Hello, welcome back to History 321. This is lecture number 8, and I am Dr. Ron Traylor. Now, we had ended lecture 7 with a discussion of some of the content uh, of the Constitution of 1845, why it was necessary, some of its content, and the impact that it had on certain parts of Louisiana. Now, we didn't finish that discussion. Let's pick up where we left off, and let's continue to talk about the Constitution of 1845. Now, uh, the things that it changed were important, and we cannot discount the importance of those changes. But probably the most important change in the Constitution of 1845 was the fact that it redesigned the method of determining representation in the state legislature. If you recall, during our last lecture, we said that according to the content of the Constitution of 1812, based on that content, the Creoles of South Louisiana had the vast majority of the power in the state legislature. And the Constitution of 1845 attempts to make it more fair and more even. Now, we also talked about the Whig Party and the Democratic Party last time, things that they liked, things that they didn't like. One of the things that the Whigs strongly supported was the influence of the planter class, whether it was sugar planters in South Louisiana or whether it was cotton planters in North Louisiana. And the Whigs were opposed to anything that would lessen that influence. Now, as regards the Democratic Party in Louisiana, and we said that generally the Democrats were probably were becoming more common in Louisiana. Some of the Democrats favored the federal method of determining representation in the state legislature. And what is that? Well, for those of you who don't know, in the United States Congress, which has a U.S. Senate and a U.S. House of Representatives, membership in the U.S. Senate is based on equality. Every state has the same number of U.S. senators. And of course, that number is 2. Also, in the United States House of Representatives, though, that is not based on equality. That is based on population. More people who live in the state, the more U.S. representatives they get. Now, and the Democrats wanted to apply that formula, if you will, to our state legislature. That membership in the state Senate would be based on equality. Membership in the state House of Representatives would be based on population for each of the districts. They also wanted to incorporate something that was in the U.S. Constitution, and that was the 3/5 slave rule. The Democrats wanted to count the slaves because, remember, Louisiana by this time was almost 50-50 white slave. And if you didn't count the slaves, uh, parishes that were not the big sugar and cotton parishes, if you didn't count their slaves, they were going to lose political influence to, for example, a parish that was mostly small farmers. So, uh, what the 3/5 rule had done in the U.S. Constitution and what they wanted it to do in the Constitution of 1845 was to count the slaves for representation purposes. And then take that number, whatever that number was, and calculate whatever 3/5 of it was, 60%. And that is how many slaves then would be used for a representational purpose. Now, look, I'm no mathematician. I'm a historian, so let's keep the math simple. If you've got 100 white guys, you count all of them for representation purposes. They are counted as 100 whole people. But the slaves are counted now. But then you calculate whatever 3/5 of that is. Well, 3/5 of 100, it's 60%. 60. So in the case of the slaves, that parish would have an additional, or that district, however they were going to do it, would have an additional 60 people, even though it was 100, they would only be counted as 60 people for representation purposes. Now, be very careful here, folks. I did not say that the 3/5 rule gave citizenship to the slaves. It didn't say that at all. Because it didn't. The only thing, the only thing that the 3/5 rule did for the slaves was to have them counted, even if it was only 60%, to have them counted for representation purposes. And the Democrats wanted that number to be based on registered voters. The number of whites who could vote would be based on the number of registered voters. Now, you can imagine the uproar that resulted from these suggestions on the part of the Democrats. And as a result, a compromise was hammered out between the delegates from New Orleans and the delegates from the high slave parishes. It has several parts. First of all, in the state senate, the total population of the entire state would serve as a basis for representation in the Senate. So the idea that representation in the Senate would be based on equality, although that's the way we do it today, its time had not come yet. And the total population would serve as a basis for representation in the state Senate. However, in the state House of Representatives, the total registered voters, okay? In the Senate, it's total population, whether you're registered or not. In the House of Representatives, it would be total registered voters only would serve as the basis for membership in the state House of Representatives. By doing this, the Whigs actually lost power. Because remember, the Whigs were opposed to anything that would lessen the influence of the planter class. And this, in fact, did lessen the influence of the planter class because it gave more power than they had ever had to people in northern Louisiana that had been disempowered for a long time. Now, the Constitution of 1845 was, in fact, ratified and put into place, and almost immediately, people all over the state of Louisiana began to realize that it was seriously, seriously, maybe even fatally flawed. There were some serious mistakes in it. Merchants didn't like it. They didn't like the idea that corporations were limited. Small farmers and wage earners didn't like it because they thought that it didn't give them enough help. So no one was really happy. Different reasons, but the bottom line is nobody was generally happy with the Constitution of 1845. And as a result, in 1852, 7 years later, a third Constitution for the state of Louisiana is written. Now, by this time, by 1852, the Whigs were in control of the state legislature. And remember, the Whigs had been on the side of the planters, and the planters didn't like the Constitution of 1845. So it shouldn't surprise us that once the Whigs took over control of the state legislature, one of the first things that they would do would be to call for a new constitutional convention whose purpose it would be to write a new constitution. Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. Um, So let's talk about the content of the Constitution of 1852. It made almost all offices, including judges, including Supreme Court judges, elective. If you want to be a judge and if you want to hold a public office in Louisiana, fundamentally, with some exceptions, but fundamentally, if you want to be a public official in Louisiana, you had to run for election. Now, let's be careful. Not just judges. All public offices become elective. Okay. Um, Remember that the Constitution of 1845 had outlawed monopolies and subsidies to private businesses. Well, the Constitution of 1852 sort of did an about face and did the exact opposite. It made a 180-degree turn. According to the Constitution of 1852, certain companies were, in fact, given special privileges, most especially banks. And among the banks, the bank that probably received the most special treatment was Citizens Bank of New Orleans, which, by the way, still exists. It lifted that state ban on the constitutional ban to state subsidies, state aid to corporations. Remember our example of the Ford Motor Company, right? That's gone, boy. You can't help them. If they want to come, they can come. They're welcome to come. But they can't get any special help from the state of Louisiana. It also lifted the ban on monopolies. Monopolies were once again legal in the state of Louisiana. And remember the differences in how state senators and state representatives were chosen according to the Constitution of 1845. Um, Total population served as the basis for representation in the Senate, while total registered voters served as the basis for representation in the state House of Representatives. Now, according to the Constitution of 1852, total population serves as the basis for representation in both the Senate and in the House of Representatives. All right. Now, we will discuss. Louisiana has had additional constitutions since the Constitution of 1852, and we will discuss each and every one of them. But let's sort of hit the hold button, hit the save button, and let's go to some other subjects before we come back to the subject of state constitution. I have mentioned slavery already a number of times in this class, but I've never really got into any detail about the institution of slavery, and I would like to correct that now. So let's talk about um, the people who. There were many people who supported, who favored the institution of slavery. Now there were those who opposed it as well, but let's talk about those who favored the institution, those who were what we refer to as pro-slavery. Well, first of all, we need to understand that Louisiana planters, cotton planters and sugar planters in particular, were getting rich. And they were getting rich uh, from the sweat that was provided in the fields by their slaves. And for years and years and years, especially under the Constitution of 1812, and it lasted from 1812 through 1845, those planters had dominated Louisiana politics. Now, not all Louisiana farmers were plantation owners. Most of Louisiana farmers were small, what we call small farmers, 40 acres, 80 acres. Um, they uh, They worked the fields themselves. They and their children, their family members, worked the fields themselves. When it was planting time, when it was harvesting time, they might hire someone to provide that extra labor that planting and harvesting requires. But generally, they did the work themselves. Let's put it another way. Most Louisiana farmers were not slave owners. Now, this goes against the narrative that many of my students have been taught since they were in the seventh grade. Most Southerners, most Louisianians owned a slave. They might have only owned one, but most Southerners owned slaves. And that's not true. Now, let me stop right here and tell you that, let me tell you what an old history professor of mine told me years ago. He said, "You are entitled to your own opinions." Each of us we are entitled to our own opinions. But he said, "You are not entitled to your own facts." A fact is a fact. Truth is the truth. And that is one of the truths. Most Southerners, most Louisianians did not own slaves. Now, that did not lessen the importance of slavery to Louisiana. It was extraordinarily important. Without the labor that was provided by African slaves, the great wealth that was amassed by the planters and the great prosperity for them would have never have occurred. And the almost overwhelming demand for cotton and sugar in other parts of the world, including other parts of the United States, would have never been able to be satisfied either. Now, whether you were a slave owning white or whether you were a non slave owning white, including poor whites. I'm talking about white people who were just on the edge of starvation. We're talking about poor people. They all felt superior to blacks. And the reason is that even a poor white is still free. Now, many Southern whites, including Louisianians, also had a great fear of freeing the slaves because they were convinced in their minds that freeing the slaves would result in a race war between blacks, who would at that point be ex-slaves, right? Farmer slaves. It would cause a race war between the former slaves and the whites. We must never forget the fact that in Louisiana, it was an almost even 50-50 mix between white and slave. For every white, there was a slave. As a matter of fact, in some states, there were more blacks than there were whites. South Carolina was one of those black majority states. And even when a state was not a black majority state, the ratio was so close that you might as well say it was 50-50, especially Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Now, how did whites justify an institution that was so obscenely evil? Obscenely evil. And I stand by that statement. The very idea that one human being could even presume to own another human being. How did they justify that? How did they get away with that? How did they make that right? Well, there were several pro-slavery arguments that justified that institution. For example, many people said that the Holy Bible sanctioned slavery. Nowhere in the Old Testament nor in the New Testament does God say slavery is wrong, it's a sin, it's evil, you shouldn't do it. No. Slaves appear in the Old Testament, and slavery appears in the New Testament. St. Paul, who started off life as Saul, right? St. Paul ordered the slaves to obey their masters. Now, he also ordered people to, if they were slave owners, to treat their slaves kindly. But St. Paul, who was so influential in the formation of the Christian church in the first century AD, St. Paul never said slavery is wrong. Jesus didn't really speak of it at all. Now, so that was used as a pro-slavery argument. That we are under no obligation to abandon slavery because we were not given the order to abandon slavery in Holy Scripture. Now, many Protestants at that time, and to be quite honest with you, even today, believe in this thing called predestination. Now, predestination is a very complicated theological argument, and this is not a theology course. And even if it was, I'm not qualified to teach it. And so, some of you might take exception to what I'm getting ready to say with regard to predestination, especially if your church is one who strongly believes in predestination. Predestination essentially says that because God is all powerful and all wise, he knows everything. He knows everything that's happened. He knows everything that's happening, and he knows everything that's going to happen. And because God is sovereign, in other words, there are no other gods before him. There's only one God, and all these other gods are false gods. Because God knows what's going to happen, and he knows what has happened, many people took that argument of predestination to say this: if Africans were slaves, it meant that God intended for them to be slaves. They were predestined to be slaves. Now, in Louisiana, the Roman Catholic Church, especially in the colonial period, and of course it's in the colonial times, both French and Spanish, slavery existed in Louisiana. The Roman Catholic Church in Louisiana, in colonial Louisiana, never said a single solitary word condemning slavery. Now, it had a lot to say about the good treatment of slaves, but that's a different thing altogether from condemning the institution of slavery. And if that all of that is not enough, many educated whites in Louisiana and across the South who knew anything about the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations were very much aware of the importance that slavery played in both of those ancient civilizations, both Greece, the Greek civilization, and the Roman. I've heard differing numbers over the years uh, about what percentage of the Roman population was made up of slaves. And I've heard from anywhere to 20% to 30%. Another concern, I've already mentioned it, another reason why uh, there was this pro-slavery argument was that Southern civilization was superior to Northern civilization. And of course, when we say that Southern civilization was superior to Northern civilization, then what we're really saying is Southern white was superior. And of course, if the slaves became free, then the result would be perhaps a race war. But even worse for many white Southerners, if slaves became free and got all the rights that whites had, the inevitable result would be what was feared so greatly: race mixing, right? we're all adults here. What were they really saying, right? Whites and blacks having sex and having babies. Also, Southern culture justified slavery by saying that slavery is good for the slave. Now, when we hear that, our jaw drops and our eyes are wide open, and we can't believe that somebody would actually ever believe that. But it's true. It is true. Many Southern whites believed that slavery was good for the slaves. Now, let's give some examples of why they would think that. Well, they said um, only Christians are going to go to heaven, right? Only Christians are going to go to heaven. And the native Africans are not Christians. They are people who worship other gods. And so slavery is good for them because it takes them out of Africa where they are heathens, and it takes them to a place where Christianity is common and a place, pardon me, where they can become Christianized and thus save their souls. And you read it in the literature quite often. The slave owner would say, I own your body now, but God owns your soul. And so someday, you'll be in the presence of God. Others uh, had no respect for Africans at all. They looked at African civilizations and they said, "Wow, these people never even invented the wheel, for goodness sakes." So how advanced can they be? Uh, and if you believe that, then the next baby step is to believing that they really think they can't take care of themselves. And what they needed is someone to take care of them. And of course, the logical next step after that is slave owners will take care of their slaves. And of course, many Southerners believed that slaves enjoyed slavery. Now, my studies have shown that uh, well, obviously that is not true. I cannot imagine anyone, no matter what the color of their skin, no matter what the country or the continent of their origin, anybody would enjoy being a slave. To prove that the slaves were smarter than the slave owners gave them credit, here's just one example. Slave owners quite often would give, when there was a special occasion during the year, one of their daughters got married, or there was a birth in the white family, or there was a death in the white family, or it was the 4th of July. All of these times were usually times, unless you were a really cruel master, these were all times when the master would arbitrarily say to the slaves, take the day off. Well, now you can imagine how welcomed that was by the slaves. To be able to sleep late every once in a while, to not have to get up during the week and be driven to the fields. And I don't mean driven in a truck, I mean being driven with whips. How wonderful that would have been just to have a day off. But, but quite often it was even better than that. Quite often, for these special occasions, the master would provide special food that he never provided for the slaves on a day-to-day basis. The slaves almost never had bread made from wheat. When a slave had bread, it was normally cornbread, which now I can't knock cornbread. It's one of my very favorite things. But you can get sick and tired of something if you do it often enough. And I would imagine that cornbread is one of those things. The only thing they ever ate was cornbread, except on these special occasions when the master, pardon me, would order loaves of wheat bread to be baked. Slaves almost never ate beef. They ate pork, and even the pork that they ate the cheap, the leftover parts. The old Southern saying is that nothing is wasted on a pig except the oink. And that's true to a large degree. I mean, think of what we don't throw much of a pig away. The in slave times, the good cuts, the roasts uh, from the uh, from the back legs, the hams, uh, the chops, those were all reserved for the whites. So what did the slaves get out of this? Well, they got the leftovers. They got the internal organs, right? The kidneys and the liver, the heart. They love that stuff. A lot of people do. Ham hocks, pig jowls, pig's feet, pig's noses. Many of you know that those are still really popular cuts of the pig today among many blacks and whites. When the skin, the hair was shaved off the skin, and the skin was then fried. And what was the result of that? What we call pork skins. And even the hair that had been shaved off was used for a purpose. It was mixed with mud, and as brick was being made, the bristles, the hair, was mixed with the mud, and it was used as a binder to make the newly fired bricks stronger. Truly, the only thing that's wasted is an oink. They even used the bladder. They would take the bladder, blow it up, right, tie it to a stick, and on the 4th of July, they would, or another holiday, they would hold that uh, air-filled bladder over a fire until it got so hot that it popped. And it was a homemade fireworks sound of it. Now, I gave that as just an example, and remember what the original question was. Could the slaves, in fact, enjoy being could enjoy being slaves? And my answer is no. But we also said that the slaves were smarter than the masters gave them credit for. The masters would give them special days off during the year, and not only were they off from labor, but they then had access to food that they normally could not eat. The slaves were sharp. And they began to ask the question, or they began to say, we need more holidays. Well, of course, if a holiday meant that you were off from work and you got some special food, let's have more holidays. And so what the slaves did, the slaves began to play their masters like a Stradivarius. For example, the master might take a business trip. He leaves New Orleans and he has to go to Memphis on a trip. And when he gets back, when the slaves realized that the master was at the front gate of the plantation, they would all throw their hose down and they would run to see him, and they would cheer and they would shout and they would cry, and they would appear to be so happy because, oh, master's home. We're so happy. He's such a fine master. He treats us so well. It's a good thing he's home. Well, the masters were human, and they loved the fact that their people loved them so much. Well, that was not the case at all. The people were trying to use the master because, as likely as not, the master would then say, oh, you love me so much. I need to show my appreciation to you. I tell you what, take the rest of the day off. Wow. So, masters quite often misinterpreted the actions of the slaves. They interpreted the slave's actions as being a manifestation or a proof of how much the slave loved the master. While in reality, the slaves were using it as a tool to manipulate the master into giving the slaves what the slaves could not provide for themselves, right? Day off from work, good food. And the masters also used this spontaneous celebration, and you notice I'm using air quotes here because I don't mean a word of it. They used this spontaneous celebration as a proof that they were well loved by their slaves. While in reality, when he said take the rest of the day off, and they all went back to the slave quarters and they were alone, it was only slaves around, they probably talked about what a fool he was for being so easily fooled. I teach History 489, which is African American history. I don't teach it every semester, I teach it periodically. But if you are interested in that entire issue of slavery, keep your ears open and find out when I'm teaching that course. And I strongly encourage you, I strongly invite you to join me in that course. All right. In the early days of the South, in the early days of Louisiana, um, many slave owners admitted that slavery was evil. They didn't make any bones about it. They very freely would have told you, had you asked them, that slavery was evil. But what they said is that it is a necessary evil. In order to sustain the Southern economy, and of course, in order to make me rich, slavery is necessary because we simply don't have enough white laborers who are willing to do this back-breaking work. We need a captive slave audience. But they never lost fact, well, they didn't lose track of the fact that at the root level, slavery was evil. It was a necessary evil. Now, as the years passed, a new anti-slavery movement appeared in the northern states, and it was called the abolitionist movement. And the abolitionists opposed the institution of slavery. The abolitionists, uh, a lot of Americans didn't even think too much about slavery. If you lived in the South, you didn't think too much about it. You didn't consider it too often because it was simply a part of life. It was as a part of life, like the sun comes up in the east and goes down in the west. You just didn't think about it. And in the North, where slavery existed in the early days, slavery was in the process of dying off. And so, if you lived in the North, you saw fewer and fewer and fewer slaves as you were out and about. And the job of the abolitionists, one of the jobs of the abolitionists then became to educate Northern people about the fact that slavery still existed in the South, that many of the Southern states were almost 50-50 white black, and South Carolina was a black majority state. And when the abolitionists began to make it known and began to publish articles in magazines and newspapers and began to write books about the evils of slavery, Southern slave owners sort of they changed their tune. Where initially they had believed in the idea of the slavery as a necessary evil, they switched their tune, and now they begin to proclaim that it was a positive good. It was a positive good. Now, remember what I said when I said that a majority of Louisianians owned no slaves, but they nevertheless identified with the planters because the planters, they shared something in common with the planters. First of all, they were all white and they were all free. Now, the federal government during the 1830s and 1840s, the federal government didn't help the slaves much. In fact, they helped slave owners quite a bit. Um, the Congress created a gag order that said that slavery is something that could not be discussed within the walls of the U.S. Senate and the United States House of Representatives. You could talk about anything else you wanted to, but there was a gag order on the institution of slavery. As a matter of fact, the federal government helped in other ways too. The post office, for example, the abolitionists would send out mail. If you read the mail, and it would be a an attempt to have you join an abolitionist organization, or even if it wasn't a request for you to join, it was at least a request for you to read about the evils of slavery and hopefully change your mind about slavery. The post office, the United States Post Office, was given orders which they obeyed, was given orders to destroy abolitionist mail if they could identify it as such. Now, folks, if you or I go to the, if we destroy U.S. mail and they can figure out that we were the bad guys, that's a federal crime, and we could wind up in federal penitentiary for that. But the post office workers who were ordered to destroy the abolitionist mail were not punished. But as the years went by, as the years went by, uh, it, it, Southerners began to assume that the financial and the social interests of the Northerners and the social and financial interests of the Southerners were totally different. And not only were they totally different, but they were irreconcilable. In other words, they could never be brought back together. Where being an American was more important than being a Southerner or a Northerner. It was more important than being an abolitionist or an anti-abolitionist. And Southern differences began to, I'm sorry, sectional differences began to grow. Now, let me stop right here and tell you that this was not anything new. George Washington served 2 terms as president of the United States. And he leaves office in March of 1797. And before he leaves office, he gives one of the most important, one of the most famous speeches in American history, and we still refer to it as Washington's farewell address. Now, in that speech, that's what it was, Washington talked about a lot of stuff, a lot of important stuff. That's really not a part of this class. But he talked about one thing that is important to this class. Washington said that even as early as 1797, he was already becoming very concerned about sectionalism between the North and the South, and what he then referred to as the West, the new states that were coming into the Union that were not a part of the old 13 states, states like Tennessee and Kentucky and Ohio. Those states at that time were considered to be the Western states. And Washington said, I can see already the differences between the North and the South and the West. And he said, unless you make a conscious effort to mend those cracks that are appearing, I can't imagine that any good can come of it. And guess what? Washington was right. Now, because we know, of course, we have hindsight, and hindsight is always 2020, isn't it? We always know what happened in the past. Wouldn't it be nice to know what's going to happen in the future? What Washington didn't know that he was right, and that the country would not mend the cracks, and that the result was going to be a civil war in which literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans wearing blue and gray would die over this idea of sectionalism. And then what Washington could not have known further is that once the Civil War settled all this, right? Wrong. Wrong. It didn't settle much of it. Slavery was replaced with sharecropping. Jim Crow laws still limited the rights of citizens. Blacks received, on paper, all of the rights of citizens. Had every bit of it. But the reality is that there were laws on the books that, in fact, limited the rights of Black Americans. And I would say that in some ways, Black Americans still have not received all the rights of citizenship. Okay. Something happened in 1857 that really made this idea of sectionalism, the differences between especially the North and the South, made it especially obvious. In 1857, the Supreme Court made a decision called the Dred Scott decision. Dred, in this case, is spelled D-R-E-D, and Scott is the normal spelling of Scott. Dred Scott was a slave who was owned by a man who was a member of the United States Army. And because he was a professional soldier, he went wherever the government wanted him to go, and always took Dred Scott with him as his personal servant. Well, Dred Scott was no fool. Dred Scott knew what was going on in the country. Dred Scott understood that there was a growing opposition to the institution of slavery. And so when his master was transferred to a state where slavery was illegal, Dred Scott sued his master for his freedom. He said, I'm living in a state where slavery is illegal. You can't treat me like a slave. You got to turn me loose. You got to give me my freedom. And that case made its way up through the court system until it reaches the United States Supreme Court. And in 1957, the Supreme Court delivers its ruling. And the Supreme Court, in the Dred Scott decision, said that slaves could not be citizens. Slaves couldn't be citizens, and free blacks couldn't be citizens. You could be free and not be a citizen. But certainly if you were a slave, you couldn't be a citizen. As a matter of fact, the Supreme Court went so far as to say that in America, a black man has no rights that a white man is obligated to recognize. Wow. A black man has no rights that a white man is obligated to recognize. And of course, the Dred Scott ruling convinced many Louisianians and other slave owners all over the country that their views of slavery were, in fact, correct. But let me tell you this: the Dred Scott caused more problems than it solved, because all over the United States, especially in the northern states, there was outrage against that decision, the Dred Scott decision. Okay, we will return to that topic, the topic of slavery, in a bit. But once again, let's change the subject, and let's talk about life and labor in Antebellum, Louisiana. And of course, you know now what that word antebellum means. It means before the war, in this case, before the Civil War. All right. In the few minutes we've got left, let's talk about life and labor in Antebellum, Louisiana. Louisiana had an agricultural economy. It was almost 100% agricultural. And the plantation was the foundation of the Louisiana agricultural economy. Uh, or so we are quite often led to believe. The reality is that while most histories of agriculture in Louisiana deals with the plantation, the vast majority of Louisiana's farmers were small farmers rather than large planters. I told you that earlier in this lecture, and some of you were probably stunned. You just thought that everybody who lived back then was a big old plantation owner and that they owned slaves. Well, that's not true at all. My great, I think, grandfather, Traylor, came from Virginia and settled in Louisiana in around 1807, and settled between the present day towns of Ponchatoula and Springfield. He settled on the Nottawabee River around 1807, while this part of what is now Louisiana was owned by Spain. It was still a part of Spanish West Florida. My grandfather was not a slave owner. He was a charcoal burner. Boy, now that is an occupation that has died over the centuries. Um, uh, Incompletely burned wood could then be reignited and used to cook. I mean, we still do that. You can go to the store and buy those charcoal briquettes to grill with, right? Well, that's what my grandpa made was that charcoal, and he did it with his labor and with the labor of his children. So, using my grandfather as an example, not all Louisianians were big plantation owners, neither were they slave owners. Most farmers didn't own a slave at all. And when they did, they might have owned one or two. Now, let's stop right here. And let me complain about Hollywood's treatment of history. Now, first of all, let me ask you the question: what is the purpose of a movie made in Hollywood? Think about that for just a minute, and then I'll give you my answer. My answer is the purpose of making Hollywood movies is to sell tickets and make money and overcharge you for popcorn, right? The purpose of Hollywood is not to tell the truth. The purpose of Hollywood is to tell a good story. And whenever the truth gets in the way of a good story in Hollywood, the good story almost always wins. So, the problem, of course, is that many Americans get their history from Hollywood. They see it on the big screen, they see it on the television, and they assume that, oh, well, they wouldn't lie to me, they wouldn't change the facts. It's got to be true. Well, it's not. Um, I'll give you the perfect example of how we get our history from Hollywood quite often. I'm going to do something. I like to do this in the classroom, up at the blackboard, okay? But Obviously, we can't do that. So we're going to do this the best way we can. Okay, I want you to just listen carefully to what I'm going to say and to vote mentally. All right. How many of you think that the average number of slaves on the average southern plantation was more than 100? Okay, more than 100. Okay. How many of you think that the average number of slaves on the average southern plantation was between 75 and 99? Between 75 and 99. Okay. How many of you think that the average number of slaves on the average plantation in America was between 50 and 74? Okay, between 50 and 74. How many of you believe that the average number of slaves on the average plantation was somewhere between 25 and 49? I think I'm doing the numbers right. Between 25 and 49. How many of you believe that the average number of slaves on the average southern plantation was between 10 and 24? How many of you believe that the average number of slaves on the average plantation is none of the above? It's either less or it's even more, right? The right number is 6. That is the average number of slaves on the average southern plantation. Going with the Wind shows us that they're on that, what was it called, Terra? There were hundreds of slaves on that plantation. Well, there were plantations that had hundreds of slaves, but the reality is that most Southerners didn't own any slaves, and those that did just owned a few, and that the average number was about 6 or 7. And of course, there are all these other errors in Gone with the Wind too. Remember? Oh, the slaves just loved Miss Scarlet. The big muscular slave overseer, the slave driver. I'm sorry, the slave driver. I forget what his name was, but he was willing to give up his life to protect Miss Scarlet. Wasn't he? Mammy, the cook, and the slave that uh, uh, was so close to Scarlet in the movie. Well, Mammy would have done anything for her baby Scarlet. As a matter of fact, and in the movie, Mammy uh, was uh, was rather arrogant, wasn't she? She was sassy. She she spoke her mind. She whatever was in her brain came out of her mouth. Right? Oh, look, none of that was a part of slavery. The slaveries didn't love their masters. The slaves, the last thing that they would have done would have given their lives probably for their master. Uh, if they had spoken up and spoke their mind, they would have been considered insolent and they would have been punished for it. So you see, all these ideas that we get from Hollywood uh, simply are not true. So let me close this lecture. And remember, this was lecture number 8. Let me close this lecture by warning you, by suggesting to you that if you want to find out what the real history is, well, come see me or read a book and forget about Hollywood. All right. All right. I'll see you soon as we begin lecture number 9. This has been lecture number 8.